Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the 1,775 poems in the Johnson edition of the Poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 49, I Never Lost As Much But Twice. It's going to be for us the first, what we would call major or often anthologized poem. So we've gone, 48 poems into the Johnson edition before we meet a poem that's going to be a more popular poem. This one obviously having all kinds of scholars making observations about it, and we'll comment as well about the relationship to one or two other poems of some importance. It's always interesting to study the poetry of Emily Dickinson from the perspective of what I have called her dance with deity. It's a complex dance. There's an ambiguity there that is often going to be associated with how well or comfortable she feels about talking about deity and about God. This is another one of those poems about loss as well, and so we'll be paying attention to that. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already been exposed to our introductory lecture as well as the previous 48 poems we just finished with Bewildered Dove. The Emily scholar David Porter has commented on the fact that in this poem we'll meet Emily's views on grieving or bereaving, from grief to bitterness to resignation and then finally to humility. I want you to pay attention to all of the trinities of this poem. And there's always the question about whether this is another Sue poem or not. It's difficult when you pick up a poem like 49 to know who it is that Emily is actually referencing. And in that regards, if it is a Sue poem, in April of 1852, she wrote, quote, in letter 85, quote, I can only thank the Father, and then she had a quotation around Father, for giving me such as you, end quote. And in another letter to her sister, she talks about the redoubtable God. And to that degree, again, this complex dance that she has with deity is significant. Let's enjoy the poem. I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sod. Twice have I stood a beggar before the door of God. Angels, twice descending, reimbursed my store. Burglar, banker, father, I am poor once more. Now, later on, much later on, when we meet poem 1732, this is one of Emily's most famous poems. It's often going to be connected. My life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. I start with that poem because I think those two poems rather nicely our companion reads. Notice she'll begin with, and by the way, hear all of the S sounds that seem to almost like to be stacked in this poem. I never lost as much but twice. Notice twice now, and it is going to be mentioned 3 times. And that was in the sod. Now, her use of the word sod is fascinating. When we get to a poem 99, for example, we'll hear her say it this way. As we play around with 99, new feet within my garden go, new fingers stir the sod. A troubadour upon the elm betrays the solitude. Her idea of her use of the word sod, it's actually quite popular. The focus in this line, I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sod, is on the word that. Because it can be understood from a couple of different perspectives. That was in the sod. Who are we talking about here? Scholars have ventured any number of names. Ben Newton, Leonard Humphrey, who she had great respect for, Sophia Holland, the dear friend. All of these are strong potentialities. In other words, I've already lost 2 people. Now, the language of economics is going to play here. We've got bankers and the like. That is to say, God has taken two, and now they're gone. They're in the sod. Depending upon how you understand her use of the word sod. And again, with Emily, nothing is obvious. So is she talking about a literal sod, or is she talking about departure or loss, and therefore not death? It's hard. Twice have I stood a beggar. Notice this is the second of the twices. Twice have I stood a beggar before the door of God. Later, of course, it'll be the Father. Before the door of God. Now, this idea of the beggar, I find a fascinating one. For example, when we hit poem 357, we'll play around this way with this idea that God is somehow very far away. In poem 357, she says it this way: God is a distant, stately lover, woos as he states us by his Son, verily vicarious courtship. When we meet poem 791, we'll play around as well with this idea of God being somehow there's something missing. God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. And then when we meet again in poem 1551, those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. This idea of God not being found, this idea of God being distant will be significant. Notice twice I stood a beggar before the door of God. When we meet poem 724, she's going to talk about the thrifty deity. It's easy to invent a life. God does it every day, creation, but the gamble of his authority. It's easy to efface it. The thrifty deity could afford eternity, could scarce afford eternity to spontaneity. This idea that God is somehow responsible for the loss seems to be, in some ways, the underpinning here. And then, from God, she goes to angels. It's significant that she doesn't say that God descending twice descending, reimbursed my store, but rather the angels did. So some have read this as the possible tension going on here. Notice we get our third twice. Angels twice descending reimbursed my store. In other words, I was given another to replace the one that I lost. And to that degree, it was the angels that helped me. Of course, it's nice that she uses the word angels, because the people who replace those lost will be for her angels themselves. Reimbursed, of course, will play the game of the economics language. Reimbursed my store, the idea that I lost but I gained, right? And then she goes with burglar, banker, father. Notice you got your threes. With burglar, we'll meet this again when we meet poem 338, and the way in which I know that he exists somewhere in silence. He has hid his rare life from our gross eyes. I find this idea that there's a notion that something's been taken and it's not coming back. Burglar, notice banker to continue with our economics language, and then now from God to Father. And then I am poor once more. Now, this use of the word poor is for us important when we meet poem 78 that's coming here soon. And the idea that a poor, torn heart, a tattered heart that sat it down to rest, this idea of poverty, this idea that things are not being provided the way that they should, will be significant for us. Of course, to say that she's poor is also to say that she's alone. Now, there is the possibility of a third potential loss here. Some have read this as the pal of hers, Wadsworth, was moving to California, and because of that, there was somehow now a third time she was going to lose someone important in her life. At 2A, what are we going to make of messages here? I think one of the arguments that she's making is when there is loss, it's always difficult to know who to blame, and it's really hard to lose the ones that you care about, either to death or to departure of another kind. At 2B, I love the economic language in this poem. And at 3A, we read it, poem 1732, Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. I think that poem can easily be read alongside. Finally, at 3B, what was a time that you felt rich, for example, maybe with your friendships, and then you lost those and you felt poor at the end? And to what degree is your dance with deity, whatever that is, understood better or worse from a poem like this? Thank you.